Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at IronHack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we're going to be having an episode which has kind of been a long time coming because we've gone through basics, we've had fantastic interviews of people going through their frameworks and so on, but I feel that there was a need for sure of having this episode that I lovingly want to call Gamification 101. So giving a few of the basics, at least that I see in this world of gamification, as being sort of an entry point to many people who have never heard the term perhaps, or are starting to get curious about it. I do think it is an episode that can be very useful for many people. And even if you've been around for a while, this might be a refresher or a point to get a discussion started as well. Exciting discussions are always super welcome. And this could be an opportunity for that as well. I'd be glad to do that through, it could be through social media. I'm on Twitter at RobAlvarezB. You can definitely find me as well on LinkedIn. I publish every episode there. I'm Rob Alvarez, and my last name is impronounceable for many people. It's Buholska, but you can you can find links to that definitely on professorgame.com. At the end of any episode, you can contact us and you'll find a list of different places where you can find especially me, so that we can, again, kickstart that discussion if you're more into it, or even make further questions. What did I miss on this episode? What did I mention that perhaps I should have? I'll be happy to make additions, to clarify things perhaps on the web, to again kick off a discussion. Always glad to do that for sure. So let's get started at the first thing. When we start discussing something, we always, the first thing is, what is the definition? What are we talking about? But there is a big but here in gamification, because gamification has been around already for a while. 5 years ago, I used to say, well, it's very recent. It's kind of starting to be not that recent anymore. So that excuse is kind of fading away. But even though, it's been around for over a decade at this point, I must also say it's still relatively young. The industry is still growing. There's still plenty of people doing great stuff, but it's hard to say that there is sort of a unified, a completely defined way of defining gamification. There are still ongoing, super interesting discussions you want to get into if that is your thing. If it's not, and this might get me into a little bit of heat, many people are not into getting into this discussion. So I always tell people, if that's not your thing, if you're still, just getting introduced, perhaps you want to simplify it down. You just want to grab any of the definitions you find is probably going to be good enough, and you can get going with that. And that is exactly what I'm going to offer you. You could go for many of those. You could go for Sebastian Iterdens, you could go for Yukai Chao's, you could go for Andrzej Marchewski, but, I am the guest of the show, and I am going to introduce you to the concept that I use with, my clients when I deliver presentations, when I deliver workshops, when I'm helping people understand what do at least I mean by gamification and the power it can have when we get into these workshops. So, having that disclaimer up front, this is not the official, because there is no official definition of gamification to this date. What I like to say is that gamification is the use of game design, game elements, and play for purposes that go beyond entertainment. So, the classic definition of, or the classic way we could see games, games that have been around for millennia, a game tends to be something that leads to entertainment. The main purpose tended at least to be entertainment. So the idea here is that we're using game design, that is, the science or the art of creating games, the design discipline of creating games, game elements, so things that you can find within games, and play, playful attitude, the things that you do when you play, for something that is not just entertainment. It could include entertainment, or it could even not include entertainment. It could still be gamification if you are using, in my opinion, game design, game elements, and or play, all right? So what is behind all of this? What do games do absolutely fantastic and have been doing it again for millennia? They're able to capture audiences' attention. They're able to capture especially the players getting so into their games that almost everything else disappears around them. Of course, not everything that you create with gamification can be, get you into what some people like to talk as flow. We'll be getting into that later on. What do I mean by flow? But it's, sort of that, actually, let's get into it. Flow is, that state when you're so immersed in an activity, you are so engrossed into the activity that almost everything else kind of fades away, time, other people, other activities happening around you, they almost kind of disappear. You've probably gone through this at some point, whether it is if you are into sports, you at some point were some sort of an athlete, again, pro, junior, whatever that looks like. You were so into it that everything else sort of disappears and you're just focused on doing that activity, that sport. If you're into games, that definitely happens probably every now and then. You kind of lose track of time and you're there playing and then you realize, oh my goodness, all these things have happened. Maybe you kind of forget something that's not ideal. But the idea is that games are able to do this. That can happen with video games, board games, sports, many, many different things. And since games are so good at doing that, even getting you a state that is close to that, where you're not necessarily so engrossed that you forget of time, because sometimes it is all about getting an activity, as Anjay, I've heard him say a couple of times, it's about getting an activity that actually sucks, a terrible activity, getting it to suck a little bit less. That is already a big improvement. Sometimes, again, it is because activities can be terrible, very unengaging, very much unfun. You don't have to get people, super excited, running around the room for it to be gamification, already making it sort of getting it unsucked a little bit. That can be good enough. That could be part of gamification. So again, my definition, the use of game design, game elements, and play for purposes beyond entertainment, because games are good at doing that. Gamification is that design discipline of using all of those concepts, all of those ideas that come from games for something else. As you probably know by now, one of my main obsessions or one of my main focuses at the very least is definitely the world of learning and the world of education. So I use gamification very much in that realm. That is my main place of study. That is, the name of the podcast is Professor Game. So of course you're thinking about, when you think about a professor, you're thinking of learning, of classes, perhaps university, formal, informal, whatever that looks like. The idea is that, at least for me, it's been very much of my focus. I've done things outside of that as well, but it definitely is one of my main focuses. So that could be a very good example, creating something so that your students, your class gets engrossed into that activity, gets excited about doing that thing that you want them to do. So that, of course, beyond entertainment, it's not about getting them to have fun and clapping and everybody happy in the classroom. It is about them learning better, or them being able to complete an activity that you had a very hard time getting people to complete. If you take it to other places, it could be things like in your personal life, you could get you to help you get the motivation to go to the gym, which is a classic thing and many people struggle with. If it is about marketing, for example, you can get people to actually perform an activity that helps your marketing. Of course, these are people that not necessarily are your employees. They're rather potential customers. In the world of, within companies, it's as well engaging people into doing those activities. Usually when, it is most popular is those activities that maybe suck a little bit. And people want to, the company leaders want to get the people to do that activity because it is important for them and or for the company. And there comes a very significant element of ethics. We have a couple of episodes on ethics, so if that is something that interests you at all, definitely go reference those. There's one I did by myself, another one with one of the ethics experts, Andrzej Marchewski. He's discussed this quite a few times. He has as well this disclaimer for the gamification code of ethics that is available for everybody. But let's not go down the line of ethics. Just to point that is there. You also want to consider, it's not just about the client or the company needs or the teacher's needs. If you're the teacher, it is also about the player's needs. The person you're trying to engage, you always want to consider that and how what you're doing is ethical. You're being at least transparent enough so that people are not being manipulated in a negative sense, just not to get again into that discussion of manipulation or not manipulation. All right. So that's it. What is gamification? That's what I think it can be used for in many cases. There's many, many different applications. I'm sure you can even think of others that I'm not mentioning here. The idea is to, again, get activities to be a little bit better. And that takes me to another very interesting question when thinking about gamification. Because the first thing that you have to do if you want to use gamification is ask yourself, why do I want to use gamification here? And, with experience from clients and listening to this in many talks as well from fellow colleagues who are doing gamification for a pretty long while as well, typical thing or the first answer you will get is because I want to make things fun. And, that could be part of the reason, but especially with businesses, especially if you're being hired for that, or if the organization you're working for, the institution you're at, is investing money in that. Oh, and talking about institutions, that is another place. Governments can also help use this to change some form of behavior. And again, this leads us to why gamification. Usually, the answer comes in the form of, the initial is, to have some fun. I want everybody to have fun. But as you know, businesses, universities, institutions are not there to help people have fun. Those are entertainment, and that is what entertainment activities are for. This is about taking it beyond that, right? So it's not just about fun. Why do you want people to have fun? You've got to start sort of going deeper into that. And typically, what gamification tends to be very good at is either increasing engagement, motivation to do a certain activity, and even sometimes changing some form of behavior or improving some sort of behavior. You want people to, conduct this new habit. Introducing elements of gamification, introducing gamification design here could be potentially very, very useful. Sometimes, and I love to use the example of gamification is not the solution because your problem has nothing to do with engagement. Sometimes it can even have to do with if it's a job offer. You don't need to gamify a job offer that is being unsuccessful. Sometimes it is just about writing it correctly. Again, this is another example from a colleague, Andrzej Marchewski. I heard it at a conference and I loved it. So I used it every now and then as well. That is a very good example. Sometimes there are the typical question of what would gamification not be useful for. I would definitely say, if you have a platform, whatever that platform is doing, if the platform is broken, you don't fix it by putting something on top of it. You have to fix, the technical bug or whatever it is that is not working. And then if you want to engage people with something, there you can use gamification. It's about engaging people, bringing them to, again, in the case of education, to learn better, to be engaged with that learning. And as you know, you've probably heard this before, people who are engaged with their learning, who are being active with their learning are definitely going to be learning a lot better. So again, this could be typically the reasons why do you want to use gamification. You want to have people engaged in the activity, or there's something that they kind of drag their feet on. It's like, oh, I don't want to do this. Monica Cornetti always talks about, those trainings, especially like legal fulfillment trainings that you just have to do, How do you get people to actually enjoy out of it and not just click here and say, oh, I completed the training. It's about them actually getting something out of it because it's not just a legal requisite. It typically, if it becomes a legal requisite, it's because there is something that people should be making sure that they know, right? So that is the typical reason why you want to use gamification. Some examples of gamification, I'm going to go with 3. First one, I like to use it very much. This is sort of a classic in gamification, is Duolingo. It is a learning app, so again, comes back to learning something I love. It's language learning, which is something I've always been very curious about. I've always felt that I'm pretty decent at languages. In fact, English is not my first language. My first language is Espanol, so Spanish. I was born in Venezuela, as you maybe know. English is my second language. I tried to learn French for a bit. I kind of understand it. I went into Chinese as well. I just wish I would have dedicated a bit more time to both of those, and I could be at this point learning other new ones as well. But anyways, I'm diverging. Getting back to the topic, the example of Duolingo, It has many elements of gamification. One of the ones that I like to introduce here are the streaks. That streak of you've been using Duolingo every day for the past 39 days or 157 days or the past 1,000 days. That would be a streak. You've been using it continuously every single day. And why do you think Duolingo uses this? My theory, and I hope at some point somebody from Duolingo comes and says, yeah, you're right. Or I would also love it if they say, that makes absolutely no sense. We did it because of this other thing. I would love Duolingo, if you're listening right now, write me an email, write me on Twitter, give me credit for saying it right, show people that I'm not saying it right. I don't mind. But my working theory is that they realized that, learning languages it's pretty difficult for many. And one of the main things is about getting practice regularly. I'd rather have, a practice of, let's say, I don't know what the number is. There's probably, articles on this, I'm sure. But, let's say 10 minutes every single day for a year, rather than having a super intense week where you every single day are immersed 100% in the language for a week and then do absolutely nothing for the rest of the year. I'm pretty sure that if you put in those 10 minutes every day, it's going to be a lot more beneficial. And guess what? Streaks are exactly about that. So you can see where the objective of getting people to come in every single day and practice every single day comes in very neatly, very usefully in something that comes as well from games, especially now in this engagement era with mobile phones and so on, where games want you to, come back every day, or the app wants you to come back every day. The game wants you to come back every day and perform a certain action. Well, that same idea of streaks is being used in an app that goes well beyond entertainment, because learning a language can be definitely entertaining or not, depends on how you view it yourself. The thing is that it goes beyond that. It's about learning the language. It's about learning more about the language itself. And that is exactly what Duolingo is trying to do. It's using this strategy taken from a game, whether they thought about it intentionally or not. They brought the strategy into their app, into their learning experience, and they used it for a specific purpose. I love that example because it sort of puts together many different things. And that one is kind of blunt, kind of obvious, because Duolingo, you see it, and it does have a lot of elements. The app is kind of constructed in many ways that you use it and you see, this is kind of like a game. It's kind of entertainment and so on, right? It's not, again, it's beyond entertainment, but you can kind of have that feel when you get into the app. Another one, different example, completely different. Go onto LinkedIn. Would you feel that LinkedIn is that sort of gaming experience? Definitely not. It is a, very serious social network for professionals, and I love it. It's a very good social network, and it's very serious. It's a professional network. It has nothing. It's not gamey at all, right? I don't know if I haven't seen it in years, of course, because I completed my profile thanks to this quite a while ago. But if you're relatively recent, or if you haven't completed your profile for whatever reason, you might notice, hopefully they still keep it, a progress bar. Games are, very, very good at this, because our brains, when you see a progress bar, your brain says, what can I do next to complete that to 100%? You sort of want completeness, right? So that element from games of progress bars was brought into LinkedIn because they realized, that you don't want a profile that is half full or that only has the name and, the email, which you cannot really show it because it's a private information probably. A profile just with a name is probably very, very useless for LinkedIn and for the user as well. So this is my theory. I didn't work at LinkedIn. If they ever want to debunk the myths that I'm sort of creating here, feel free to do that, LinkedIn, if you're listening. Hopefully you will actually say, well, actually it makes sense. It's kind of the thought process that we went through. The idea is that they realized that, having that few information is not useful. Again, not for LinkedIn. It's not useful for the user either. So they want you to have your profile as full as possible. But that kind of contradicts that basic sort of UX principle of, you want people to log in, to register for the first time. Keep it as simple as possible. So, name, email, password, keep it simple. Once the people are logged in, then you can do other things. Of course, if you keep it so simple, again, the profile is going to be useless. So how do you bridge that gap between having name, email, and password and having a full profile with, education, current job, past education, skills, abilities, blah, all of these super interesting things that LinkedIn has. So they decided, amongst other things probably, and some nudging and so on, to have this progress bar which shows how far your profile has gone in terms of being actually complete, right? So they show this example, they show it there, and you say, oh, okay, so I'm at 5%, I'm at 50%. How do I get this to 100%? What is the next best step I can take? As far as I can remember, you sort of clicked on it and it showed you some suggestions of what to do next. And it gets you every time you get in, you see that progress bar again and say, all right, I really want to get it to 100%. You can do maybe a small action to take it a little bit further, and eventually you get to that 100%, which again is beneficial for you as a user because your profile is complete. It's going to be useful for you as a LinkedIn user. It's also useful for LinkedIn so that it keeps you engaged and in the app and providing value for you. It's a win-win situation. Again, in my opinion, very ethical in that sense. Both people are both sides of the transaction are getting some benefits in different ways. And as well, it gets you to do that thing that they needed for you to do with a progress bar, which is an element from games, right? I love that one. And just to sort of extract us out of the digital world and as well show an example from a fellow colleague, Ann Coppins, there is this game that she created. It's actually an award-winning game from one of the conferences I've been at, which is called Hexagon, like hacking, Hexagon. That is actually, where these are post or COVID times at the moment, and there's a lot being digitalized, a lot being just happening digitally, whereas many of these things were being held physically before. It's also a good time to remember that the physical world is still out there. We might be already back or coming back at some point. It's really useful, I think, to keep that in mind. And I think this example helps ground us in that sense as well. This is a board game that Ann Coppins created for a company. Again, she showcased it in a conference, she got an award for it. It was a competition as well. And it is a board game to help the employees of this certain company that hired her and her company, Gamification Nation. They hired Gamification Nation to help people understand some of the problems and solutions of cybersecurity. So it doesn't get any more digital than cybersecurity. And she created something, she extracted it entirely from the digital world and turned it into a board game, a physical experience, again, pre-COVID. People sat around the table, played the game, and understood many of the risks, many of the things you actually have to do, how difficult it is to do that for cybersecurity, and how important that can actually get to be, right? She used, and that is very obvious. It is actually a board game, right? So it's a game in itself. It has all, a bunch of game elements, has a bunch of things that, I think it also has dice, it has cards, it has meeples or something similar to meeples. It has a bunch of things, a bunch of elements of games. Actually, it is a game, and it goes well beyond entertainment. So it fits the definition that I used at the start. And again, there's a super interesting discussion why this could or could not be gamification. I'm not going to get into the depths of that at this point. So that's it. 3, I think, very neat examples that hopefully give you a clearer idea of what gamification could be going around, could be doing for you. There are many other uses. My colleague and friend Betty Adamo has a book on how to use gamification in games for market research. That is super exciting. Another colleague has Albert van der Meer has a book on gamification in marketing. He has a book with somebody else. He's one of the co-authors. There's a bunch of different applications you could use it for. I just wanted to show you a few of those examples. And finally, I'm going to sort of invoke a few terms that you might be hearing around in gamification, and I might bring in some controversy here, especially for people who have been around a while and who get very, very strict, and I understand it. I agree with that in many ways, about what is and what is not, gamification. And there I'm going to throw in a few other terms: serious games, games-based learning, games-based solutions, purposeful games. There's many: gameful UX, gameful strategies, game design, game thinking. There's many ways in which this can be seen. But again, for now, especially if you're starting off, I am going to invite you for now to ignore all of those different terms and just put an umbrella term over that and say it's gamification. That is going to be good enough, especially for you to kickstart your career. And if you're interested in getting into the super interesting discussion of which is and which isn't, happy to get into that with you in the future. But for now, again, gamification 101. So let's get into some terms. And again, I'm going to be controversial on this one. You might hear things like game mechanics, game elements, gamification mechanics, aesthetics in games. There's many things in there that could be contained. And again, I am perfectly aware that these are different, but for the purposes of actually perhaps designing your first thing or using gamification for something for the first time, I am going to tell you, look, these can be exactly equivalent for you. So things like using a narrative, things like Easter eggs, things like, and again, you can put gamification mechanics and you'll get, for example, a list created by Andrzej Marchewski. You might get other lists from other people. Yukai Chao has a whole game around finding all of his game mechanics. But again, game mechanics, gamification mechanics, game elements, there's a bunch of ways of understanding this, and they're easy to mix up if you're not like super expert and very well versed in that. But for your purposes, for using these things, because in the end, typically it's about understanding the basics of this and how do I use them. For you, and again, this might be controversial, but for you, you can take these as equivalent. They work for the same thing in your case, right? The game mechanics, game elements, gamification mechanics, these things are basically things that you put in your toolbox that you take around and use them to solve different problems. So your problem is usually going to be engagement, but it comes in different forms. And of course, it has different motivations, and the company culture could be different, or the organizational culture, the classroom culture can be different, and you introduce different ones of these from your toolbox depending on what it is you want to reach, what is the context where you're applying it, and so on, all right? So game mechanics, game elements, gamification mechanics, aesthetics, all of these things, kind of put them in the same box and have that within your toolbox and use them as appropriate. And that leads me to one of those game mechanics, or three of those game mechanics that are typically the first ones you hear. And when you hear PBL, so PBL, right? When you say it quick, PBL, you say, oh, what the heck is that, right? PBL are points, badges, and leaderboards. This could be three of the things that you put in the box before. So points, I think they don't need too much of an explanation. Points are, they could be experience points, they could be health points. There's many ways of seeing and understanding points, but the idea behind it is using points to, have some sort of reference about something, whether it is your experience, if there are experience points in the game or in the system that you're creating. Health points, because for whatever reason you earn or lose health depending on the actions that you take, etc., or just accumulating points as you advance through the game. They're just points, right? They're very useful for keeping track of things, but if you only refer to gamification through the lens of PBL, so points, badges, and leaderboards, you're probably going to be missing out a lot. And I'm not saying these are not good and super useful, and definitely within gamification. I'm just saying don't focus on those only. Badges, as you might know, don't focus on those only because you're losing out a lot. Badges, just to give a very quick overview of the other two, badges are, like a merit badge, or you earned something as you give a badge. Badges, again, can be useful, especially when they are meaningful. So you achieved them because you achieved something. That can be meaningful. But if you give somebody a badge for logging into the system, it's probably not going to be meaningful for them, usually, right? So maybe if you do it for logging into the system, 100 days in a row, it kind of has a little bit of meaning because they did some sort of effort to log in every single day. And again, it has to be tied with the objectives you're trying to reach. So if you're trying to reach something by getting somebody to log in for 100 times, maybe a badge could be useful, could be in order. And finally, leaderboards, you probably heard of them. It's ranking people from first until last. This can be very, very controversial using of leaderboards. There are some ways in which they can be used successfully, but if you're not like very well versed in the world of gamification, and you're not having your profiles that you're trying to engage are not like super competitive. But when I say super competitive, I mean most, if not all of them, not just, the top 10 are super competitive and the rest are not. Because if that's the case and you use leaderboards, you're going to engage that top 10 and you're going to ignore the rest of the people in many cases. So be careful with leaderboards. They can be useful under certain specific circumstances, but they can also be very demotivating for a huge amount of people. All right. Not everybody is into that competitive nature. And again, depending on the context, it might be good, it might not be so good. Especially in learning, to be honest, I don't recommend it too much, especially for longer periods of time. If it's within a class and you just use it as a reference for that game, it can kind of be okay in general terms. But again, try to stay away from it, especially at the start. It's not going to be as useful as many other mechanics like narrative, like progress bars, like feedback, like introducing a theme, random rewards, Easter eggs, exploration. Like there's many other things that you can introduce before getting into leaderboards, right? So that is a term that gets thrown around a lot, PBLs, and people say, PBLs are not good. And if you're an expert, you've heard 1,000 times, PBLs is, just the basics. It's not even the basics. It's sometimes just bad gamification. It gets kind of a bad rap in general. It can be used well, but again, it is typically not sufficient. It's just not enough, right? In fact, Yu-Kai Chao's book is Gamification, and it's, I can't remember the exact title, but it's going something like beyond points, badges, and leaderboards, because it's, it's going beyond, it's going further than just that. Another term that I want you to keep in mind is players. We refer to the users of our systems, of the designs that we create, as players, because they tend to have, in games and in gamification, that you want them to have a very active role, all right? That's mainly the reason why we call them players. And of course, they're very active. They're in control. The thing in video games that you use to interact with video games, with the consoles especially, it's called a controller. You want the player to be the protagonist at the center of everything that you create, so that they make their own decisions, so that they are active, so that they feel that they're the ones sort of saving the world in that sense. They're the only ones who can do that thing, right? So understand them as players, and you'll already be very well ahead of people who are not thinking through the lens of gamification. Another thing that gets thrown around a lot, and this is more generalized, this can be used in many other places and is being used in many other places as well, is prototyping, right? So prototyping is creating a prototype, a sort of, it sometimes kind of gets mixed up with a MVP, but creating a prototype so you can basically test what it is that you have created to see if it is working decently enough. Actually, the idea is that you find out what is not working and you're able to improve it, go back, build another prototype, and test it again. And that process is actually called iterating. You're iterating on your designs until you get something that is good enough and you're able to sort of officially, formally launch it. And even then, you are hopefully still able to iterate around a bit, especially if it's not physical, because you can, just like the apps in the app world that are being updated all the time, you can probably be still doing something like that. And these last things that I've mentioned are definitely part of my way of understanding gamification. When I teach in workshops, I always talk about understanding the why and creating the objectives. I talk about the players. I talk about the game mechanics and the section sort of design. I talk about prototyping and about playtesting for sure, which is another word before I forget about it, and then iterating. Playtesting is all about doing those tests with your players. You have that prototype, you play test it with them. You get them to play your design as much as they can so that they can use it and you can find those flaws in your system. Again, I hope this episode was useful for you. I threw around a bunch of things. You might want to go back in the episode and see that it was a relatively longer discussion about what is gamification, why using gamification as well. I gave out 3 examples of gamification of Duolingo, LinkedIn, and Hexagon by Anne Coppens' Gamification Nation. She definitely has a team, so it's not just her. Some terms that we can be discussed as well. This one was the controversial one of sort of mixing and putting in the same box game mechanics, game elements, gamification mechanics, aesthetics, and many other things. We discussed points, badges, and leaderboards, so remember PBLs. We talked about the players, we talked about prototyping, we talked about play testing, we talked about iteration, and we definitely left many other things on the table, but that'll be for Gamification 102, hopefully at some point, or if you have an opportunity to be in a workshop with me, there's like many different things we can get into, but I think with this sort of baseline, hopefully you'll be able to listen to other episodes as well with under a different light. And maybe you'll have more questions as well. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Subscribe to the email list and you can ask me by email. Go to Twitter, as I mentioned before. You go to professorgame.com/Twitter and that'll send you to my Twitter account. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find any of this on professorgame.com. You can subscribe to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Answer to my email, make me questions, ask for a different episode, a compliment to this episode, ask questions on the blog. Feel free to do any and all of that at any point. So thank you again for your attention. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for being part of this podcast. Hopefully, again, this was useful for you to refresh, to pop new ideas into your mind, to start a discussion with, saying, Rob, you're not right. These are the things that you should have said. Or saying, why did you mix these things together? Whatever that looks like, hopefully it'll bring some interesting discussions just as well. However, as I always like to say before we end the episodes, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.